Arthur Kingston and Richard Langley were names that resonated throughout the city, synonymous with success, power, and wealth. Arthur, an influential businessman, was known for his sprawling empire that spanned multiple industries. His face graced the covers of magazines, and his achievements were the subject of admiration and envy. He lived in a mansion on the outskirts of the city, filled with luxuries that most people could only dream of. Despite his opulence, Arthur often found himself staring out of his large windows, feeling an emptiness that his wealth could not fill. He was surrounded by people, yet he felt profoundly alone. On the other hand, Richard Langley was a renowned investor with an eye for opportunities. He had amassed great wealth, owning properties across the globe, with a lavish lifestyle to match. Richard had everything a man could desire: expensive cars, exclusive memberships, and the respect of his peers. But as he grew older, the excitement of wealth began to fade. He had no one to share his success with, and his relationships were mostly transactional. Richard found himself spending his evenings in his grand penthouse, feeling the weight of his solitude, questioning the purpose of it all. Both men had climbed to the pinnacle of success, yet they found themselves isolated from the world they once knew. Their achievements had created a barrier, separating them from the simple joys of life and the genuine connections they longed for. They were constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from them, be it money, influence, or an opportunity. The pressure of maintaining their wealth and status only deepened their disconnection from reality. They both yearned for something more, something that could give their lives meaning beyond the figures in their bank accounts. Arthur and Richard had never crossed paths personally, but they were aware of each other. Their circles overlapped at exclusive events, high-profile galas, and charity auctions. Yet, these encounters were superficial, marked by polite nods and obligatory handshakes. Neither man had ever taken the time to understand the other or to see beyond the veneer of success that the world admired. They were, in a sense, competitors. Two titans in the same city, each too consumed by his own world to consider the other as anything more than a rival. The turning point for both men came in different ways but led them to the same conclusion: they needed a change. For Arthur, it was a moment of realization while watching a news report on the growing homelessness crisis in the city. He remembered his own struggles in his early years, a time when he had nothing but hope and determination. He wondered if he had lost the essence of who he was in the pursuit of wealth. The faces of the people on the screen haunted him, reminding him of the person he once was, and the compassion he seemed to have forgotten. For Richard, the change began after a visit to a hospital. He had gone to see a former employee who had been loyal to him for decades and was now battling illness. Richard saw firsthand the struggles of ordinary people, those who didn't have the luxury of the best medical care, those who fought every day just to get by. He left the hospital feeling a pang of guilt, realizing that his wealth had insulated him from the realities faced by so many. He wanted to do more than just write checks to charity. He wanted to understand what life was like for those less fortunate. The story truly begins when fate brings Arthur and Richard together, not at a lavish event, but in a completely unexpected place, a poor neighborhood known for its struggles. Arthur, disguised as a homeless man, had decided to live on the streets for a few days, wanting to experience firsthand the challenges faced by the less fortunate. Richard, meanwhile, had volunteered with a charity organization, choosing to spend his time anonymously helping the homeless, hoping to find some sense of purpose that his wealth could no longer provide. It was in this neighborhood, amidst the narrow alleyways and the cold night air, that Arthur and Richard's paths finally crossed. Two men who had everything, yet felt they had nothing, met in the most unlikely of places. They spent an unforgettable night together, not as wealthy tycoons, but as two individuals stripped of their status, facing the raw and harsh realities of life on the streets. This encounter would become the catalyst for a profound change in both their lives, setting them on a journey to rediscover the true meaning of wealth, compassion, and connection. One cold morning, Arthur Kingston stood in front of his grand mirror, dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in ragged clothing that he had gathered from charity bins. He had made up his mind. He was determined to experience the life of those who had fallen through society's cracks, the people he had once been but had since forgotten in his pursuit of wealth. His disguise was simple but effective: worn-out jeans, an old tattered coat, and a beanie that covered his recognizable features. Arthur looked at himself one last time before stepping out of his mansion, ready to leave behind the comfort and luxury he had known for decades. Arthur found a spot near a crowded subway station, sitting down with a small cardboard sign that read, "Need help." The first few hours were a shock to his system. the cold biting through his coat, the indifferent gazes of passers-by who barely registered his presence, the bustling city that moved around him as if he were invisible. It was humbling, and it made him realize how far he had come from his own humble beginnings. As the hours turned into days, Arthur began to feel the despair that gnawed at him. The streets were not just harsh, they were isolating. The people around him, once seen as fellow citizens, now seemed to exist in a different world, one that moved too quickly for him to be a part of. Meanwhile, Richard Langley was struggling with his own sense of purpose. After his visit to the hospital, he knew he needed to do more than just donate money. He had contacted a local charity organization that worked closely with the homeless, asking them for a way to volunteer without revealing his identity. He wanted to understand the lives of those less fortunate, not from the viewpoint of a benefactor but as an equal. The charity organization was initially skeptical, but Richard insisted. They finally agreed and gave him a simple task: deliver food to the homeless, blend in, and listen to their stories. Richard's first day on the streets was eye-opening. He wore simple clothes, nothing that suggested the wealth he possessed. The charity provided him with a cart of warm food, and he made his way to one of the rougher neighborhoods in the city, the same neighborhood where Arthur had set up his spot. Richard approached groups of homeless individuals, offering food, but what struck him most was not their hunger, it was their eyes. He saw weariness, pain, and a longing for connection, emotions he had rarely encountered in his world of business deals and corporate success. He listened as they told him their stories, stories of job loss, broken families, health crises, and the relentless cycle of poverty. On the third night of Arthur's experiment, as he sat shivering in his corner, Richard appeared with his cart of food. Richard did not recognize Arthur, and Arthur, with his head down, did not pay much attention to the man distributing food. Richard approached Arthur, handing him a container of warm soup. For a moment, their eyes met, and something shifted. Richard saw a look in Arthur's eyes that he couldn't quite place, a depth of sadness and longing that mirrored his own. Arthur, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if the man before him wasn't just another volunteer. "Thank you," Arthur mumbled, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. Richard nodded, offering a small smile before moving on. That brief encounter planted a seed in both their minds, an inexplicable feeling that they were connected in some way. Arthur spent that night thinking about the man who had shown him kindness. The warmth of the soup was a stark contrast to the indifference he had experienced from others, and it reminded him of what he had once valued: human connection, the very thing he had lost in his pursuit of wealth. The following day, as Richard returned to the same neighborhood, he noticed Arthur again. This time, he sat down beside him. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" Richard asked. Arthur looked up, surprised, but nodded. They began to talk, at first about the cold, the city, the people passing by. Slowly, their conversation deepened. Richard asked Arthur how he had ended up on the streets. Arthur, staying in character, spoke of hardships, of losing his way, of how easy it was to fall when there was no one to catch you. Richard listened, his heart heavy, recognizing the same fears and vulnerabilities that haunted him. As they spoke, Arthur began to see Richard not as a wealthy man playing at charity, but as someone genuinely searching for meaning. Richard, in turn, found himself drawn to Arthur's honesty, his rawness. It was refreshing compared to the polished facades he was used to. They spent hours together, sharing stories, not as billionaire tycoons but as two men trying to make sense of their place in the world. By the end of the day, they had formed an unspoken bond. Richard offered Arthur a blanket before he left, promising to return the next day. Arthur watched him walk away, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't just about surviving the streets anymore. It was about understanding why he was there, what he could learn, and how he could change. The days that followed saw Arthur and Richard meeting at the same spot, continuing their conversations. Arthur remained in his disguise, and Richard never questioned it. They spoke about the disparities in society, the privilege that separated them from those who struggled daily, and the loneliness that both wealth and poverty could bring. They began to see each other not as rivals or strangers, but as allies in a shared quest for meaning. Arthur's experiment, initially meant to be a solitary journey, had turned into something far more profound. He had found a partner in Richard, someone who understood the emptiness that wealth could not fill. And Richard, who had come to the streets seeking purpose, found in Arthur a kindred spirit. Together, They began to realize that perhaps the answers they were searching for could only be found by embracing the very humanity they had once overlooked. It was a cold evening in the city's poorest neighborhood when Arthur and Richard's paths crossed in a way that neither could have anticipated. Arthur, in his disguise as a homeless man, sat huddled near a makeshift shelter he had crafted from cardboard and old blankets. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the chill of the evening was biting through his ragged clothing. He had no idea that tonight he would meet someone who would change the course of his journey. Across the street, Richard Langley walked with careful steps, carrying a large bag filled with food. He scanned the faces around him, looking for those in need. He had no idea that among the homeless was Arthur, the very billionaire whose success he had often heard of. Richard approached a group of homeless individuals and began distributing food, exchanging a few words with each person. When he reached Arthur, he handed him a sandwich and a bottle of water. Arthur looked up, his face partially obscured by the beanie, and their eyes met briefly. There was something in Arthur's gaze that caught Richard off guard, a depth of sadness, vulnerability, and perhaps recognition. Arthur mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," and Richard, sensing something different about the man in front of him, paused for a moment before moving on. The night wore on, and as the temperatures dropped further, the small group of homeless individuals gathered around an improvised fire to keep warm. Richard decided to sit down nearby, feeling an urge to stay longer, to understand more. He settled next to Arthur, sharing the warmth of the fire and the silence of the cold night. They exchanged glances but said nothing at first, simply watching the flames flicker and dance. The world around them seemed to fade, and for a moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the world, bound by an unspoken understanding. Eventually, Richard broke the silence. "It's a cold one tonight, huh?" he said, his breath visible in the cold air. Arthur nodded, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "Colder than I expected," he replied, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. There was a pause before Richard spoke again, this time his tone softer. "How did you end up out here?" he asked. Arthur hesitated, then decided to stay in character. "Life just fell apart," he said, his voice tinged with a sadness that was both real and part of his disguise. "Lost my way, lost everything. It's easy to fall when there's no one to catch you." Richard listened, nodding slowly. He could feel the weight of Arthur's words, and they resonated with his own experiences. Though their lives had taken different paths, the sense of loss and disconnection was something Richard understood all too well. He found himself opening up to this stranger, sharing his own story of loneliness, of broken relationships, of a son he never got to know. Arthur listened, his heart aching as he realized how similar their stories were in terms of the emptiness they both felt. He was reminded of his own past, of the struggles he had faced before wealth had insulated him from such raw emotions. For the next few days, Arthur and Richard continued to meet at the same spot. They spent their nights huddled near the fire, talking about the things they had lost and the dreams they once had. Richard spoke of the emptiness that lingered even after achieving everything society deemed valuable. Arthur, in his role as a homeless man, spoke of how it felt to be invisible, to be ignored by people who refused to acknowledge his presence. The more they talked, the more they realized they were not so different. The barriers that had once defined them, wealth, power, status, seemed to dissolve in the face of their shared vulnerability. One night, Richard spoke of the son he had never known, a child born out of a fleeting relationship whom he had never been given the chance to meet. His voice was filled with regret, and Arthur could hear the pain in his words. It struck a chord within Arthur, who realized that despite their different circumstances, they both carried wounds that had never healed. Richard's honesty moved Arthur, and for the first time in a long while, Arthur felt a sense of genuine connection with another person. As the days went by, their bond grew stronger. Richard still had no idea that the man he was confiding in was one of the wealthiest individuals in the city, and Arthur found solace in being seen not as a billionaire but as just another person. Through their shared stories, they found a sense of camaraderie, a mutual understanding that transcended their social statuses. It was during these moments that Arthur began to see the true cost of his wealth, the distance it had created between him and the people around him. By the end of their time together in the poor neighborhood, Richard offered Arthur something more than just food. He offered him his friendship. "You know," Richard said one evening, "I don't know where life will take either of us, but I'm glad I met you. Sometimes, it takes losing everything to find what really matters." Arthur nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I think you're right," he replied. It was in that moment that Arthur realized his experiment had given him more than just a glimpse into the lives of the less fortunate. It had given him a chance to find the connection he had long yearned for. Their meeting was fateful, not because of who they were on the surface, but because of what they had found in each other: understanding, empathy, and the courage to confront their own emptiness. The journey that began with Arthur's bold experiment and Richard's search for meaning had now brought them to a place where they could begin to heal and rediscover what truly mattered in life. One cold night, as Arthur and Richard sat near their usual spot by the makeshift fire, a commotion drew their attention. Across the street, a group of teenagers was gathered around a frail homeless woman, taunting her. The teenagers laughed as they kicked over the few belongings she had. The woman, her face etched with years of hardship, cowered in fear, her hands raised defensively as the teenagers mocked her. Arthur and Richard exchanged a look, and without hesitation, they stood up. They knew they couldn't just sit by and watch. Richard was the first to approach the group, his voice firm but calm. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he called out, his tone leaving no room for argument. The teenagers turned to face him, their laughter faltering as they saw the determination in his eyes. Arthur, though disguised, moved with an air of authority that seemed to give Richard even more presence. The two men advanced toward the group, their figures illuminated by the dim streetlights. "Leave her alone," Arthur said, his voice low but commanding. The teenagers, sensing they were outmatched, began to back away, muttering insults under their breath before finally scattering into the darkness. The homeless woman, still trembling, looked up at Arthur and Richard with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Arthur knelt beside her, offering her his blanket, while Richard helped pick up the scattered items: an old bag, a few clothes, and a worn-out photograph. "Are you okay?" Richard asked gently, his eyes filled with concern. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked down at her belongings, her hands shaking as she tried to gather them. Arthur and Richard helped her move to a safer spot near the fire, where she could sit and regain her composure. Once she was settled, the woman began to speak, her voice soft but steady. "My name is Margaret," she said, her gaze distant. "I wasn't always like this, you know. I had a home, a family, a life." She paused, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames of the fire. "But life has a way of taking everything from you when you least expect it." Arthur and Richard listened intently as Margaret shared her story. She spoke of a time when she had a stable job, a loving husband, and a daughter she adored. But one misfortune led to another. Her husband passed away suddenly, leaving her to fend for herself and their daughter. The bills piled up, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't keep up. She lost her home, and eventually, her daughter was taken away by social services. Margaret's voice cracked as she recounted the day she watched her daughter being driven away, her small face pressed against the car window, tears streaming down her cheeks. Richard felt a pang of guilt as he listened, realizing how easily life could unravel for anyone. He thought of his own life, the comfort he had taken for granted, and the relationships he had neglected. Arthur, too, felt a deep sadness as he heard Margaret's story. He thought of his own mother, who had struggled to make ends meet when he was a child. He realized that the line between success and despair was far thinner than he had ever allowed himself to acknowledge. Margaret looked at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "I don't expect pity," she said. "I just want people to see me, to see that I'm still human, despite everything." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. "We see you, Margaret," he said softly. "And we're going to help you." Richard nodded in agreement, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for so long. Their actions that night did not go unnoticed. Other homeless individuals in the area, who had been watching from a distance, began to approach, offering their thanks and sharing their own stories. For the first time, Arthur and Richard felt a genuine connection with the community around them. They were no longer outsiders looking in, they were part of something larger, a group of people bound together by shared struggles and a desire for dignity. As the night wore on, the fire grew warmer, and the circle around it grew larger. Arthur and Richard listened to the stories of others, stories of loss, resilience, and hope. They realized that these people, whom they had once seen as mere figures in the background of the city, were individuals with rich histories and dreams that had been shattered by circumstances beyond their control. The connection they felt was unlike anything they had experienced before. It was raw, real, and deeply human. By the end of the night, Arthur and Richard knew that their journey was far from over. They had come to the streets seeking understanding, and they had found something far more profound, a sense of belonging, a community, and a purpose that went beyond themselves. Margaret's story, and the stories of the others they met, had given them a new perspective on the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. Arthur looked at Richard, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "We have to do more," he said, his voice filled with determination. Richard nodded, a newfound resolve in his heart. "We will," he replied. Together, they had taken the first step, not just in defending Margaret, but in becoming part of a community that needed them. And in doing so, they had found the beginnings of the change they were both searching for. The night after helping Margaret, Arthur decided it was time to reveal his true identity to Richard. The bond they had formed over the past few days had been genuine, and Arthur could no longer pretend to be just another man on the streets. He wanted Richard to know who he truly was and why he had chosen this path. As they sat by the makeshift fire, Arthur took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He turned to Richard, who was staring into the flames, lost in thought. "Richard," Arthur began, his voice steady but serious. Richard looked up, his brows furrowing slightly. "There's something I need to tell you. I haven't been completely honest about who I am." Richard's eyes widened slightly, curiosity and confusion mixing in his expression. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious. Arthur removed his beanie, revealing more of his face. He looked Richard in the eye, trying to gauge his reaction. "My name isn't just Arthur. I'm Arthur Kingston." He paused, letting the name sink in. Richard's eyes widened further, and he blinked in disbelief. "Arthur Kingston?" "The Arthur Kingston?" he asked, his voice a mixture of shock and incredulity. Arthur nodded. "Yes, the very same. I know it must be hard to believe, but I wanted to experience life on the streets, to understand what it's like for people who don't have the privileges I've been given. I've spent so much of my life surrounded by luxury that I lost touch with the reality that so many others face." Richard was silent for a long moment, his mind racing as he processed what Arthur had just told him. He looked at the man sitting beside him, the same man who had shared stories, defended Margaret, and sat by the fire every night, appearing no different from any other homeless person. The realization that this was Arthur Kingston, the billionaire whose name was synonymous with wealth and success, left Richard stunned. "I don't know what to say," Richard finally whispered, shaking his head. I thought you were just like the rest of us." Arthur smiled gently, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "In many ways, I am, Richard. Wealth and power don't protect you from loneliness, regret, or the emptiness that comes from losing touch with what really matters." He looked at Richard earnestly. "I want to make a difference, not just by throwing money at problems but by truly understanding them. And I couldn't have done that without meeting you and everyone else here." Richard's initial shock began to fade, replaced by a sense of admiration. He could see the sincerity in Arthur's eyes, and it moved him. He realized that Arthur, despite his wealth, was seeking the same thing he was: connection, meaning, and a way to make a real impact. Richard reached out and placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You've got guts, Arthur," he said with a small smile. "Most people in your position wouldn't even think of doing something like this." Arthur nodded, grateful for Richard's understanding. "I'm glad you see it that way. And there's something else I want to talk to you about. Something important." Richard tilted his head, intrigued. "What is it?" Richard's gaze softened, and he took a deep breath. "It's about my son. I never told you this, but I recently discovered that my son, Chris, is living on the streets. I never knew him growing up. I made mistakes, and now I want to find him, to help him if I can." His voice broke slightly, and he looked away, pain evident in his expression. "I don't even know where to start. But after meeting you, I feel like maybe we could do this together." Arthur listened, his heart heavy with empathy. He could see how much this meant to Richard: the regret, the desire to make amends, and the hope that he could still make a difference in his son's life. Arthur reached out and placed his hand on Richard's arm. "We'll find him, Richard," Arthur said firmly. "We'll find Chris and help him. You don't have to do this alone." Richard looked back at Arthur, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He nodded, a sense of determination beginning to build within him. "Thank you, Arthur. I don't know if I could do it without you." Arthur gave him a reassuring smile. "You're not alone anymore, Richard. We're in this together." From that moment, their mission became clear. They would use everything at their disposal, Arthur's resources, Richard's knowledge of the streets, and the connections they had made within the homeless community, to find Chris. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they had defended Margaret and connected with the community. Now, they had a new purpose, to bring hope to someone who needed it most. The journey that had begun as a search for understanding had transformed into something far more profound. It had become a mission to heal, to reconnect, and to bring light to a life overshadowed by hardship. As they sat by the fire that night, Arthur and Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fire crackled, and the night air was cold, but within them, there was warmth, the warmth of friendship, of hope, and of a shared mission that transcended wealth and status. They had found each other, and now they were ready to find Chris and make a difference, not just in his life, but in their own as well. Arthur and Richard spent the next few days reaching out to their contacts in the homeless community, asking if anyone had seen Chris. The descriptions Richard provided, a young man, around 20 years old, with a distinctive scar on his left cheek, soon bore fruit. One morning, they received word from a man named Benny, who said he had seen Chris staying in an abandoned building a few blocks away. Benny led them to the location, and as they approached, Richard's heart pounded with a mix of hope and fear. They found Chris sitting in a corner of the run-down building, his back against the wall, staring blankly ahead. His clothes were worn, and his face bore the signs of fatigue and hardship. Richard hesitated for a moment, unsure how to approach his son after so many years of absence. But Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him the silent encouragement he needed. Richard took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Chris," Richard called softly, his voice almost drowned out by the sounds of the city outside. Chris looked up, his eyes narrowing as he tried to recognize the man before him. There was a long silence, and then recognition dawned. "Who are you?" Chris asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm your father, Chris. I know it's been a long time, and I know I've made mistakes, but I'm here now. I want to help you, if you'll let me." Chris stared at Richard, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then he scoffed, shaking his head. "You want to help me? Where were you all these years?" His voice was filled with bitterness, and Richard could hear the pain behind the words. Richard's eyes glistened with tears as he knelt down in front of his son. "I know I can't change the past, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life. Please, let me try." Arthur watched from a short distance, his heart heavy as he witnessed the strained interaction between father and son. He knew this was not going to be easy, that the wounds of the past could not simply be erased with a few words. But he also knew that Richard's determination was genuine, and that Chris deserved a chance at a better life. Arthur stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Chris, I'm Arthur. Your father and I have been looking for you. We want to help you, not just with money, but with real support, a place to stay, a chance to start over." Chris looked at Arthur, then back at Richard, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He had spent so long on his own, fending for himself, that the idea of accepting help seemed foreign to him. But there was something in Richard's eyes, a sincerity that Chris hadn't seen in a long time. Slowly, he nodded, his expression softening just a little. "Okay," he said quietly. "But I'm not making any promises." Richard smiled, tears streaming down his face. "That's all I'm asking for, son. Just a chance." They took Chris to a small apartment that Arthur had arranged, a modest but comfortable space where Chris could feel safe. The first few days were awkward. Chris was guarded, unsure of how to react to the sudden presence of his father in his life. Richard, too, was unsure of how to bridge the gap that had grown between them over the years. But Arthur was there to guide them, offering gentle advice and helping them find small ways to connect. Arthur spent time with Chris, sharing stories of his own struggles, the times when he had almost given up, the moments when he had felt completely alone. He told Chris about his journey from poverty to wealth, and how he had lost sight of what truly mattered along the way. "I know what it feels like to think that no one cares," Arthur said one afternoon as they sat together in the apartment's small kitchen. "But you're not alone, Chris. You have people who care about you, and we're not going anywhere." Richard, meanwhile, tried to make up for the lost years in his own way. He cooked meals for Chris, though his culinary skills were far from perfect. He asked Chris about his interests, his dreams, things he had never had the chance to ask before. Slowly, Chris began to open up. He spoke of his love for drawing, how he used to sketch on scraps of paper he found, and how it helped him escape the harsh realities of life on the streets. Richard listened intently, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "We'll get you some proper supplies," Richard said, his voice filled with determination. "You deserve a chance to follow your passion." As the days turned into weeks, the walls that Chris had built around himself began to crumble. He started to trust Richard, to believe that maybe, just maybe, his father truly wanted to be part of his life. Arthur, always there to offer support, helped Chris enroll in an art program at a local community center. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, a step toward a new life. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Chris looked at Richard and Arthur, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A place to call home, people who care. I'm still scared that it might all disappear." Richard reached over, placing a hand on his son's. "I can't promise that everything will always be perfect," he said. "But I can promise that I'm here for you, no matter what. We're in this together." Arthur nodded, his heart swelling with pride as he looked at the two of them. "We've all made mistakes," he said. "But what matters is that we're here now, doing our best. And that's enough." In helping Chris, Arthur and Richard found a sense of purpose that they had been searching for. It wasn't just about providing financial support, it was about being there, offering love, guidance, and a second chance. Together, they were not only helping Chris start a new life, but they were also transforming their own lives in the process. The journey was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever came next, as a family. With Chris beginning to settle into his new life, Arthur and Richard found themselves thinking about the broader impact they could make. Their journey over the past weeks had taught them invaluable lessons, not just about the struggles of the less fortunate, but also about the power of empathy, resilience, and second chances. It was this realization that led them to decide that their next step was to establish a charity fund dedicated to supporting young people like Chris, those who had slipped through the cracks of society and needed help to find their way again. They named it the Second Chance Fund, a symbol of hope and opportunity for those who had nowhere else to turn. Arthur used his business acumen and resources to set up the fund, while Richard brought his understanding of the struggles faced by people living on the streets, ensuring that the initiatives were genuinely impactful. The fund would provide not only financial assistance but also mentorship programs, skills training, and access to education, all the things that could give someone a real chance at building a better future. One of the first initiatives they launched was an art program at the local community center, inspired by Chris's love for drawing. They wanted to create a space where young people could express themselves, discover their talents, and build confidence. Chris himself became a part of the program, helping to teach and inspire others. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had something valuable to contribute, and it gave him a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. Arthur and Richard also began to share their story publicly, not to seek praise, but to inspire others. They spoke at community events, schools, and business gatherings, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond material wealth and recognizing the value of human connection. Arthur shared how his time on the streets had changed him, how it had opened his eyes to the reality that true wealth lay not in money or possessions, but in the relationships we build and the kindness we show to others. Richard spoke of his journey to reconnect with his son, of the mistakes he had made, and the power of second chances. Their message resonated with many. People from all walks of life began to contribute to the Second Chance Fund, some with money, others with their time and skills. The community started to come together, united by a shared belief in the power of compassion. Young people who had once felt abandoned and hopeless were now finding opportunities, mentorship, and a sense of belonging. The ripple effect was undeniable. Their story had sparked a movement, one that was transforming not only individual lives but the community as a whole. One evening, as Arthur, Richard, and Chris stood in front of a group of young people at the community center, Arthur looked around the room, his heart swelling with pride. He could see the hope in their eyes, the belief that they could have a better future. He turned to Richard and Chris, smiling. "This is just the beginning," he said. Richard nodded, his eyes glistening. "We've already come so far, and there's so much more we can do." For Arthur, Richard, and Chris, the establishment of the charity fund was more than just an act of philanthropy. It was a testament to the power of love, redemption, and the belief that everyone, no matter their past, deserved a second chance. They had found each other, they had found their purpose, and now they were determined to help others find theirs as well. The culmination of their journey led Arthur, Richard, and Chris to an event in one of the most underprivileged areas of the city. The community gathering was held in a small park, with makeshift tents and tables set up to provide food, clothing, and support to those in need. It was a day dedicated to hope, and the three of them were determined to make it count. Richard stood before the gathered crowd, his voice carrying over the chatter and laughter of children playing nearby. He shared his story and Chris's journey, speaking openly about their struggles, mistakes, and the second chances that had brought them to where they were now. His words were filled with honesty, and as he spoke of reconnecting with his son, many in the audience were visibly moved. Richard's vulnerability showed that true strength came from embracing one's past and using it to inspire change. Meanwhile, Arthur worked quietly in the background, helping to prepare and serve food to the people who had come. He moved through the crowd, exchanging warm smiles and kind words, feeling a deep sense of connection with everyone around him. For Arthur, this moment was not about recognition or applause. It was about being part of something bigger than himself, about giving back in a meaningful way. Finally, Chris took the stage. He looked out at the faces before him, people who had faced hardships just like he had. With a deep breath, he spoke about his dreams and how his life had changed since Arthur and Richard had found him. His words were simple but heartfelt, and as he spoke, the hope in his voice resonated with everyone present. It was a moment of transformation, not just for Chris, but for the entire community. The story of Arthur, Richard, and Chris was not just a journey of discovering compassion and the true meaning of wealth. It was an awakening. For both Arthur and Richard, the experiences they had shared had changed them deeply. They had learned that the power they held was not in their money or status, but in their ability to bring hope and happiness to others. Arthur had once believed that his wealth defined him, but after spending time on the streets and forming genuine connections, he realized that true wealth was in the relationships he built and the lives he touched. The satisfaction he felt from giving back and being part of the community far exceeded any success he had achieved in the business world. It was in those small, selfless moments that Arthur found his purpose, a purpose that went beyond profits and accolades. For Richard, reconnecting with his son and embracing his vulnerability had given him a new perspective on life. He understood that the mistakes of the past did not have to define his future, and that redemption was always possible if one was willing to try. His journey with Chris had shown him that being a father was not about providing material comfort, but about being present, listening, and offering unconditional love. The bond they had formed was more valuable than anything he had ever gained in his career. Together, Arthur, Richard, and Chris discovered that the greatest legacy they could leave behind was not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the lives they uplifted and the hope they inspired. Their story became a testament to the idea that true wealth lies in compassion, in second chances, and in the courage to change, not just for oneself, but for the betterment of others.